Professor Spencer Overton, in your book, Stealing Democracy, The New Politics of Voter Suppression, what is the voting matrix that you talk about?
Well, there's a movie called The Matrix, and basically in that movie, computers are in control. People think they're in control, but in fact, computers are in control. And I was fascinated by this theme of these unseen factors that control our lives, these invisible systems that control our lives. And that's how it is really with regard to our election system. We don't think about it. We think that, the people select the politicians, but actually, in fact, this matrix of election laws and systems and regulations, they shape who gets elected. They shape the policy in our country. They determine, or at least they shape, the level of mercury in the air that we breathe, how many kids are in a classroom in the city of Detroit. So they have a huge impact that we don't always appreciate.
And explain how that matrix of laws work. Where do they start and how far down do they go?
Right. Well, one unique thing about the United States is that we don't have a central system in terms of election laws. We've got over 4,000 different election systems, and they all have different rules and laws and people who administer them. So there's not like one puppet master, like some grand conspiracy. We've got all these different systems, and most people are familiar with the most common example of this, which would be gerrymandering, right? Where politicians draw districts that favor them. Right now Congress is what about a 14 or 15% approval rating, maybe even lower than that. And yet 85% of members of Congress, they're safe. They're safe because they've drawn their districts, or state legislatures have drawn their districts so that those members are safe. And so that's the most blatant form. But when we talk about photo ID procedures, when we talk about the placement of polling machines, a variety of other practices, regulations that really shape outcomes and shape policies and winners and losers.
Who is Michael Berman?
Michael Berman is a person who handles redistricting in California. He's a Democrat. His brother, Howard Berman, was a member of Congress. And Michael had this organization called Bad Campaigns here. And so it was his job to redraw the map in California. And so he did a couple things. One thing he did was his brother's district, he dropped it from 45% Latino down to 31% Latino, so his brother would be safe and wouldn't face a challenge in the Democratic primary by a Latino candidate. Another thing he did is he got Democrats and Republicans together to preserve incumbent power. So in other words, sometimes we see these gerrymanders and they're partisan gerrymanders, meaning one party's trying to draw lines to pick up as many seats as possible. In California in that particular year, basically the Democrats got together with the Republicans and they said, hey, let's not push for party gains, let's preserve our own seats here. And let's focus on an incumbent gerrymander. Let's draw districts that benefit us so that we're not challenged. So that's Michael Berman.
Spencer Overton, what role do computers play in our current election system?
Right.
And is it a good role or not so good?
Computers are a tool, right? So I think they can be great and they can also cause problems. Now with redistricting, incumbents and people like Michael Berman can do more than ever. They have much more data. They can map things much more easily. Before, people used to guess and estimate about the census and where people lived, and taking data from lists and putting it on a map and that kind of thing. Now politicians are much more efficient in terms of drawing maps. So on one hand, it empowers politicians. On the other hand, people can actually draw their own maps and see. I mean, there's technology democratizes this to a certain extent because people can draw their own maps. There are other uses of technology. For example, many countries in the world have voter registration modernization. It means that the government registers people. You don't have to turn in some paper form, and it's not on the individual. And because it's automatic, more people are registered and more people end up voting. So technology can be really a good in terms of increasing access, or it can be a bad in terms of manipulating rules.
Do you trust electronic voting machines?
I think that there are certain safeguards that we need to have in terms of electronic voting machines.
Such as?
We need certainly audits in terms of electronic voting machines. We need backup systems. We need much more monitoring of private companies and vendors. And I think the best analogy is Las Vegas, right? Vegas, you know, they have electronic machines in terms of their gaming machines. And there are people who are on the inside, you know, who manipulate some of these machines, people who've been caught and imprisoned, right? And as a result, they have procedures to check folks who work on these machines. And so I think that a voting machine is not, you know, not really unlike a slot machine, an electronic slot machine. And it is certainly important that we have checks, structural checks, to ensure that, you know, there's not tampering, there's not fraud, there's not a problem.
You use the word suppression
Right.
in the subtitle of your book, The New Politics of Voter Suppression.
Right.
How are votes suppressed? By the ways you've described, such as not registering everybody automatically, or are we talking illegal activities to suppress voters?
You know, it is, you know, the question is, what is illegal, right? It's certainly improper. I mean, if you're going to make a law that suppresses voters, it's not necessarily illegal, but it could be improper when we talk about a goal of government of, by, and for the people. So just for an example, I know that photo ID is really wildly popular. It seems pretty reasonable. Most people say, hey, you need an ID in an airport to get on an airplane. 75% of Americans agree that photo ID is, you know, is a good thing. The problem, though, is that 20 million Americans don't have a photo ID. And, you know, that's more people than, you know, Delaware, New Mexico, and about 10 or 11 other states combined. So there are a lot of people who don't have an ID. And so that's a real problem. And on the other side of the equation, there's not that much fraud out there. And when I say fraud, I mean at the polls fraud. A lot of the fraud that we do see is absentee fraud as opposed to at the polls fraud. So in Ohio, for example, they did a study and they found that for every 2 million votes cast, there was one that was improper. So 1 vote out of 2 million. So my biggest concern is that we're throwing the baby out because the baby has a drop of bathwater on the baby's arm. We really need to figure out how to focus on that drop of bathwater as opposed to throwing the baby out.
What about the location of polling places? Why is that important?
It's very important in terms of, well, there are a variety of factors. One would be the location of polling places, but also things like machine counts. How many machines are in a polling place? And it's important because we want everyone to be able to cast a vote. And if it's more difficult for certain people, certain populations, certain precincts to cast a vote, that's going to shape election outcomes. I'll give you an example. Tanya Thivner, she went to the polls in Columbus. And before the election, election officials knew that they needed 5,000 machines, but they decided instead to only go with 3,000 machines. Tanya goes to the polls. It takes her 4 hours that she waits in line to vote. After she votes, she goes over to her mother's house. Her mother lives in a suburb. It took her mother only 15 minutes to cast a ballot. And so, you know, we've got these disparities across the country in terms of voting and opportunities to vote. And, you know, it doesn't take 4 hours at Starbucks or 4 hours at McDonald's. You know, those companies, if you had to wait in line for that long, they'd go out of business, right? Voting is